They will not make it to that courthouse. I do not care how you do it. Just make sure those two old fools never arrive." Victor Haynes ended the call without waiting for a response. He stood at his office window, watching the snow fall over the Montana mountains, a thin smile spreading across his face. 40 years the Becketts had refused to sell. 40 years they had stood in the way of progress. But today, that would end, one way or another. 300 miles away, an elderly couple stumbled through a blizzard they were never meant to survive. And somewhere between them, a man who had sworn never to save anyone again was about to break that promise. Before we continue, tell us where you are watching from today, and have you ever helped a stranger who turned out to change your entire life? The wind howled across the Montana forest road like a wounded animal. Snow fell so thick that visibility dropped to barely 20 feet, turning the world into a swirling white void where even the tallest pines became nothing more than shadows. Mason Cole gripped the steering wheel of his red pickup, knuckles white against worn leather. At 38, his gray-blue eyes carried the vigilance of a man who had spent 15 years expecting danger from every direction. A faded scar ran along his left forearm. He never talked about it. He never talked about most things. Beside him, Coda lifted his head, ears pricking forward. The German Shepherd was 6 years old, his black and tan coat thick against the cold. He had been Mason's partner for 8 years, first in the teams, then in the quiet exile that followed. Shrapnel had damaged his rear leg during their last deployment, and he still limped when temperatures dropped. But his instincts remained perfect. Mason noticed the change immediately. Coda never alerted without reason. "What is it, boy?" The dog whined, pressing his nose against the window, his breath fogging the glass. Mason slowed the truck, squinting through the windshield wipers that fought a losing battle against the accumulating snow. Then he saw them. Two figures emerged from the white curtain ahead, moving with the painful slowness of people who had already given everything they had. An old man, hunched against the wind, one hand gripping a wooden walking stick, while the other arm wrapped protectively around the woman beside him. She stumbled with every third step, her gray knit cap barely visible above the collar of her heavy coat. They were walking, in the middle of a blizzard, on a road that led nowhere for another 15 miles. Mason pulled the truck to the side and killed the engine. Before he could give a command, Coda had already scrambled over him, pawing at the door handle. The dog knew. He always knew. The cold hit Mason like a physical blow when he stepped out. Wind drove ice crystals into exposed skin. His boots sank 6 inches into fresh powder as he moved toward the couple, Coda racing ahead. The old man saw them coming and stopped, positioning himself between Mason and the woman. Even exhausted, even frozen, his first instinct was to protect her. Mason recognized that impulse. He had seen it in soldiers, in fathers, in men who would die before letting harm reach the people they loved. Up close, the situation was worse than he feared. The old man's lips had turned purple, hands shaking with a tremor that had nothing to do with fear. Hypothermia was setting in. The woman's eyes seemed unfocused, staring past Mason at something only she could see. "Get in the truck, right now. You are not walking another step." The old man straightened his spine, summoning dignity from some reserve that should have been empty hours ago. "We do not need charity. Our car broke down. We just need to reach town. Town is 15 miles that way." Mason pointed into the white void behind them. "You would be dead in 3. Get in the truck." Something flickered in the old man's eyes, pride warring with reality. But before he could respond, the woman's knees buckled. Mason caught her before she hit the ground. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, just bones and determination wrapped in a wool coat that was nowhere near warm enough for this weather. Coda pressed against the old man's legs, herding him toward the truck with gentle insistence. "Please," the old man whispered, and in that single word Mason heard the surrender of a man who had fought as long as he could. Mason carried the woman to the truck, settling her gently in the back seat. The old man climbed in beside her, wrapping his arms around his wife with hands that had finally stopped shaking because they had gone numb. Coda jumped into the back, wedging himself between the two elderly passengers as if he could transfer his own body heat to them through sheer will. Mason cranked the heater to maximum and pulled back onto the road. In the rear-view mirror, he watched the old man rub his wife's arms, murmuring words too soft to hear. The woman's eyes had closed, but her chest rose and fell with steady breaths. They would live. For now. But something in Mason's gut told him that surviving the cold was only the beginning of their problems. The cab grew warmer as the miles passed, heat pouring from the vents until the windows began to fog at the edges. Mason kept his eyes on the road, but his attention split between driving and monitoring his passengers. The old man had stopped shaking, which was good. The woman had begun to murmur quietly, which was concerning. "Tommy will fix it," she said, her voice dreamy and distant. "Tommy always knows what to do." The old man's face crumpled for just a moment before he smoothed it back into composure. He patted his wife's hand with a gentleness that spoke of 50 years of practice. "Irene, rest now." "But Tommy, I know. Mason caught the old man's eyes in the rear-view mirror. Grief lived there, the kind that never really healed, just learned to hide better with time. Mason recognized it because he saw the same thing every time he looked in a mirror. "Your son?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. The old man nodded slowly. "Was." Mason did not press further. Some questions answered themselves. They drove in silence for 10 minutes before Walter spoke again. "I am Walter Beckett. This is my wife, Irene." "Mason Cole. Thank you for stopping, Mr. Cole. Most people would not have. Most people would not be walking through a blizzard." Mason glanced at him in the mirror again. "What happened to your car?" Walter's jaw tightened. "Engine died. About 4 miles back. Just stopped running. No warning. Cell phone? No signal. Has not been any since we left home this morning." Mason filed that information away. A car that died without warning. No cell service. An elderly couple stranded on a remote road in the worst storm of the season. Coincidences happened, but in his experience they happened a lot less often than people wanted to believe. "Where were you headed?" Walter hesitated. Beside him, Coda had settled his head on Irene's lap, letting her stroke his fur with trembling fingers. The dog never allowed strangers to touch him. Never. But he lay there now like he had known this woman his whole life. "The courthouse," Walter finally said, "in Whitmore. There is a hearing today. In this weather, they would have postponed. They did not. We called yesterday to confirm." Walter's voice carried a bitter edge. 10 a.m. final hearing. If we are not there, we lose. Lose what? Everything. The word hung in the heated air of the cab. Irene's hand had stilled on Coda's head, her eyes suddenly clear in a way they had not been before. "Our home," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. 40 years we have lived there, raised our boy there, buried him from there." Her gaze found Mason's in the mirror. "And now they want to take it." Mason kept driving, processing this new information. Property disputes happened all the time, especially in rural Montana, where land values had been climbing as mining companies discovered new deposits. But something about the way Walter's shoulders had tensed, the way Irene's momentary clarity had surfaced at exactly this topic, told him there was more to this story. Coda stirred, nosing at something in Walter's coat pocket. Before the old man could stop him, the dog had pulled out a wet envelope, its paper softened by melted snow, but still intact. Coda, no. Mason reached back, but Walter had already retrieved the envelope. It is all right. He turned it over in his hands, revealing bold black letters across the front. I suppose you should know what you have gotten yourself into. Mason read the words upside down in the mirror. Final hearing. Property dispute. Mining company called Haynes Extraction, Walter explained. They have been after our land for 3 years now, ever since they found mineral deposits on the neighboring properties. He tucked the envelope back inside his coat. We refused to sell, so they found other ways. Other ways? Lawyers, permits, claims that our property lines were never properly surveyed, that our deed has irregularities. Walter's voice grew harder with each word. They have more money than we could earn in 10 lifetimes. We have been fighting them with everything we have. But today, he trailed off, looking out at the endless white. Today is the end, one way or another. Mason processed this in silence. He had a schedule to keep. Danny was waiting at the hospital in Billings, about to go into surgery. Mason had promised to be there before they wheeled him in. That was why he was driving through this storm, why he had left his cabin before dawn. Danny was his brother in everything but blood. They had served together for 12 years, watched each other's backs through firefights and losses, held each other up when the weight of what they had done and seen threatened to crush them both. When Danny called last week to say the cancer had come back, that they were going to try one more time to cut it out, Mason had not hesitated. But now these two elderly strangers were in his truck, and the nearest shelter was 40 miles in the wrong direction, and they were talking about losing their home, their memories, the last piece of their dead son they still had left. Mason checked the clock on the dashboard. 8:47 a.m. The courthouse opened at 10. Danny's surgery was scheduled for 2 p.m. Whitmore was 90 minutes east. Billings was 3 hours north. The math did not work. He could not do both. If you have ever had to choose between two people who needed you, drop a comment below. Sometimes the hardest decisions teach us the most about who we really are. He was still calculating options when the radio crackled to life. Storm warning update. Highway 17 closed due to multiple accidents. All travelers advised to seek shelter immediately. Highway 17 was the main road to Whitmore. Walter heard it too. The old man closed his eyes, and Mason watched something die in his face. Hope, maybe, or the last thread of faith that the universe might show them mercy just this once. That is the only road, Walter said quietly. Unless what? There is an old Forest Service route. Comes out about 10 miles from town, but it is not maintained anymore. In weather like this, it would be suicide, Mason finished. Yes. Silence filled the cab. Irene had drifted off again, her hand still resting on Coda's head. The dog's eyes were open, watching Mason with an expression that seemed almost expectant. Mason thought about Danny, lying in a hospital bed, probably cracking jokes with the nurses to hide how scared he was. He thought about the promise he had made, about all the times Danny had been there when Mason needed him, including the dark months after the incident that had driven Mason out of the teams and into isolation. Then he thought about Tommy Beckett, a man he had never met, a son who would never come home to help his parents fight this battle. He thought about what it meant to have a home, to have 40 years of memories in one place, to have raised a child and lost him and still kept going because that was what you did when you loved someone. He thought about the little boy in a collapsed building on the other side of the world, the one whose hand had slipped from his grasp at the last moment, the one whose eyes still visited him every night, in dreams he could not escape. Mason had not saved that boy. He had failed, and the failure had broken something inside him that 6 years of solitude had not managed to fix. But these two people were alive. They were here. And maybe, just maybe, helping them would not erase his failures, but it might prove that he was still capable of doing something right. "The forest route," he said. "How long?" Walter's eyes widened. "You cannot be serious. The road is barely passable in summer. In a blizzard." "How long?" 3 hours. Maybe 4 if the snow is deep." Mason looked at the clock again. 8:52. 3 hours would put them at the courthouse around noon. Too late for the hearing. Unless... What time does the courthouse close? 5 p.m. And if you arrive late but before closing, can you still file something? Request a continuance? Walter blinked, clearly not having considered this angle. I suppose, if we had grounds, if we could show we were prevented from attending by circumstances beyond our control. A blizzard seems like a pretty good circumstance to me. But the mining company's lawyers will argue we should have left earlier, should have prepared better. Let them argue. Mason turned the truck around, heading back toward the junction where the forest road split off from the main highway. "We get you there before 5. We get you in front of a judge. We make them listen. After that, it is up to the law." Walter stared at him. Why would you do this? You do not know us. You have somewhere else to be. I can tell. Why risk your life for strangers?" Mason did not answer right away. The truth was complicated, wrapped up in guilt and grief, and a desperate need to prove that he was still the man he used to be before everything fell apart. But he could not explain any of that to Walter Beckett. He barely understood it himself, so he said the only thing that made sense in the moment. "Because Coda likes you, and he never likes anyone." It was not much of an answer, but Walter nodded slowly, accepting it, perhaps understanding that some things did not need to be fully explained to be true. Irene stirred in the back seat, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at Mason, then at the road ahead, then at the determination set in her husband's jaw. "Are we going home?" she asked, her voice small and hopeful. Walter squeezed her hand. "We are going to try." Mason turned onto the forest road. The snow was deeper here, untouched by any other vehicle, a white ribbon disappearing into a cathedral of frozen pines. The truck shuddered as the wheels bit into the powder, searching for traction. Behind them, through the falling snow, Mason thought he saw headlights. Another vehicle, maybe half a mile back, moving slowly but steadily in the same direction they had come. He watched for a moment longer, but the lights disappeared behind a curve, and he told himself it was probably nothing. Another traveler seeking shelter, a local who knew a shortcut home. But his instincts, honed by 15 years of combat and survival, whispered something different. Something was following them. And in his experience, coincidences happened a lot less often than people wanted to believe. Mason pressed the accelerator harder, and the truck surged forward into the storm. The forest road tested every skill Mason had ever learned. Narrow, winding, and buried under snow that reached the bottom of the doors in places, it demanded total focus. He read the terrain the way he had once read hostile territory, anticipating hazards before they appeared. In the back seat, Walter had fallen silent, his attention fixed on Irene as she slept. Coda remained pressed against them both, a living blanket of warmth. 20 minutes in, Mason noticed the old man studying him. "You were military," the old man said. Not a question. "Yeah? Which branch?" "Navy." Walter nodded slowly. "I can tell. The way you drive, the way you watch everything at once. My boy was the same way." Mason felt something tighten in his chest. "Your son was in the service?" "Navy too. Became a SEAL right out of training. Proudest day of my life, watching him receive his trident." Walter's voice carried the weight of memories that still hurt to touch. He was 22 years old. Looked like he could take on the whole world. The trident. Mason's hand unconsciously moved to his own chest, where his pin used to rest before he packed it away in a box he never opened anymore. The small anchor, eagle, and trident that marked a man as one of the elite. The symbol of everything he had been before he became nothing. When did he... Mason let the question trail off. Some things did not need to be spoken fully. 4 years ago? Mission overseas. They never told us the details. Walter's hand found Irene's, holding it gently, even in sleep. Just showed up at our door with a flag and words about honor and sacrifice, as if those words could fill the space where our son used to be. Mason gripped the steering wheel tighter. He knew that notification process. He had been on the other end of it twice, standing beside officers as they delivered the worst news a family could receive. He remembered the sounds parents made when their world collapsed, sounds that still echoed in his nightmares alongside the other ghosts he carried. "I am sorry," he said, because there was nothing else to say. He loved being a SEAL. Said there was nothing else he could imagine doing with his life. Walter paused. In his last letter home, he wrote about a mission where things went wrong. His team was pinned down and he got hit. Said another operator came back for him, carried him out under fire. Mason's blood turned to ice. He wanted to find that man someday, thank him properly. But he never got the chance. The truck hit a deep rut. Mason corrected automatically while his mind reeled. It could not be. The odds were impossible. But a memory surfaced unbidden. 8 years ago, a valley in Afghanistan, an ambush, a young SEAL with bright eyes who had taken rounds to his vest and leg, pinned behind a rock with no real cover. Mason remembered the calculation, risk versus reward. He remembered deciding he would not let another brother die. He had run through open ground with bullets kicking dirt at his heels, grabbed the kid, hauled him to safety, never learned his name in the chaos that followed. "What was his name?" Mason asked. "Your son?" "Thomas. Thomas James Beckett. But we called him Tommy." The questions burned in Mason's throat, but Walter had fallen silent, and Mason could not bring himself to push. Not yet. What would you do if you discovered that a stranger you helped was connected to your past in ways you never imagined? Subscribe now and stay with us to find out what Mason discovers next. 40 minutes in, Coda lifted his head, a low growl building in his throat. His ears flattened, body rigid with tension Mason had learned to trust. "Walter, when your car broke down, did you see anyone else?" The old man frowned. "A black SUV passed us right before the engine died. The driver slowed down, looked at us, then kept going without stopping." Mason's jaw tightened. Convenient engine failure, isolated location, a storm that would have killed them before anyone found them. "This mining company, How far would they go to get your land? Walter's silence spoke volumes. Things happen, he finally said. Fences get cut. Equipment breaks. Strange cars drive by at odd hours. Last month, someone left a dead deer on our porch. Irene stirred in her sleep. Walter stroked her hair. That house is all we have left of Tommy. His room is still there, his medals on the wall, his drawings in a box. He looked at Mason with too much pain in his eyes. If we lose that house, we lose him all over again. The road curved sharply. As Mason slowed, he caught a glimpse through the trees. Headlights, distant but definite, following their path. His suspicions crystallized. They were being hunted. But whoever followed them had made one mistake. They thought they were chasing a helpless old couple. They did not know about Mason. They did not know about 15 years of training. Mason allowed himself a grim smile. They would learn. Mason spotted an abandoned ranger station through the trees, its weathered roof barely visible beneath accumulated snow. He pulled the truck behind the structure, positioning it where passing vehicles could not see them from the main trail. Inside, no lights. Stay quiet. He helped Walter guide Irene through the door, while Coda took point, sniffing every corner before allowing them to enter. The station had been empty for years, but its walls remained solid, and an old stone fireplace dominated one corner. Mason found dry wood stacked beside it, left by rangers who had abandoned this outpost long ago. Within minutes, a small fire crackled to life. Irene sat close to the warmth, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames with an expression that seemed far away. Tommy loved campfires, she murmured. Every summer, he and Walter would disappear into these mountains for a week. I stayed home baking pies, waiting for them to return with their stories. Walter settled beside her, wrapping a dusty blanket around her shoulders. The tension in his face had eased slightly in the firelight, though his eyes kept drifting toward the frost-covered window. Mason positioned himself where he could watch both the door and the road outside. Coda lay at his feet, ears rotating like satellite dishes, tracking sounds no human could detect. They passed by, Mason said after 20 minutes of silence, heading deeper into the forest. But they will double back when they realize we are not ahead of them. Then what do? We wait. Let them waste time searching the wrong direction. Then we move. Walter studied him in the firelight. You have done this before, not just driving through storms. This tactical thinking, evading pursuit. Mason did not respond. The memories that question summoned were not ones he wanted to examine, especially not here, not now, with these people depending on him. Irene reached out suddenly, her thin fingers finding Mason's hand where it rested on his knee. Her touch was cold, but surprisingly strong. You carry something heavy, she said, her voice clear in a way it had not been for hours. I see it in your eyes. The same weight Tommy carried every time he came home. Mason looked at her, this elderly woman whose mind wandered but whose perception cut straight to the bone. We all carry things, he said quietly. Yes, but some of us learn to set them down occasionally. She squeezed his hand. Tommy never learned that. He thought he had to hold everything alone. I wonder sometimes if that is what made him volunteer for missions others refused. The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling upward. Mason watched them rise and fade, thinking about the young operator he had carried out of that valley 8 years ago. Had that been Tommy Beckett? Had Mason saved him only for him to die on another mission years later? I could not save everyone, Mason heard himself say. the words escaping before he could stop them. "There was a boy. Years ago. I tried to pull him out of a building that was coming down. I almost had him." Irene's grip tightened on his hand. She did not offer empty comfort or meaningless platitudes. She simply held on. "Almost means you tried when others would have run. Almost means that boy did not die alone, wondering if anyone cared enough to reach for him." Mason's throat constricted. 6 years he had carried this guilt, and never once had anyone framed it that way. "Tommy's last thoughts were not of fear," she continued. "They were of the brothers who fought beside him, the ones who tried. That is what matters. Not whether you succeed, but whether you reach." Koda lifted his head sharply, a low warning sound building in his chest. Mason was on his feet instantly, the moment of vulnerability sealed away. Through the window, headlights returned along the forest road, moving slower now, more deliberately, searching. "Time to go!" They moved through the back of the station, Mason supporting Irene, while Walter followed with Koda guiding him through the knee-deep snow. The truck started on the first try, and Mason pulled onto a narrow maintenance path that paralleled the main road. For the next hour, they played a deadly game through the frozen forest. Mason used every skill he had learned in 15 years of operating in hostile territory. He killed the headlights and drove by moonlight reflecting off the snow. He doubled back on his own tracks. He found a frozen creek bed and followed it for half a mile, leaving no tire tracks. Twice, Koda's sudden alertness warned them of approaching vehicles. Each time, Mason pulled into dense tree cover and killed the engine, waiting in frozen silence while headlights swept past. Irene held her breath. Walter gripped his walking stick like a weapon. And Mason watched, calculated, planned their next move. The third time Koda alerted, it was different. The dog did not just stiffen. He growled, low and dangerous, his hackles rising along his spine. Mason saw why immediately. The SUV had found them. It sat blocking the path ahead, engine running, headlights cutting through the gray morning light. 2 men stood beside it, arms crossed, waiting. "Stay here." Mason opened his door. "Mason, do not. Stay here. Keep Irene warm. If anything happens, you slide behind the wheel and you drive. Do not stop until you reach the highway." He did not wait for Walter's response. Koda moved to follow, but Mason held up his hand. The dog understood. He would guard the Becketts while Mason handled this. The snow crunched under Mason's boots as he approached the SUV. The 2 men watched him come, their postures relaxed, but their eyes sharp. Corporate muscle, not professionals. Dangerous enough to threaten elderly couples, but not trained for what Mason represented. "You boys are a long way from anywhere," Mason said, stopping 10 feet from them. "Must have gotten lost in the storm." The larger one smirked. "No loss. We found exactly what we were looking for." He nodded toward the truck. "Those old folks need to come with us. Mr. Haynes has some paperwork for them to sign." "That's so?" "That is so. And you should keep driving. Forget you ever saw any of this. Better for everyone." Mason tilted his head, considering. "Here is the thing. Those people are under my protection now. That means anyone who wants to get to them has to go through me first." The smaller man laughed. "Through you? 1 guy against 2? Those are not great odds, friend." "You are right. They are not." Mason smiled, and something in that smile made both men take an involuntary step backward. "You should probably call for backup." What happened next lasted less than 30 seconds. The larger man reached inside his jacket. Mason closed the distance before his hand emerged, redirecting his arm, using his own momentum against him. One precise strike to the solar plexus, and the man folded. The smaller one was faster, pulling a knife from his belt. Mason sidestepped the first slash, caught the man's wrist on the second, and applied pressure to a point that made fingers go numb. The knife fell into the snow. A sweep took the man's legs out from under him. Neither attacker was seriously injured, but both lay in the snow, gasping, unable to rise, completely neutralized. Mason crouched beside them. "Go back to Mr. Haynes. Tell him the Becketts have protection. Tell him that if anyone comes near them again, I will consider it a personal invitation. And tell him I have recordings of everything. Threats, pursuit, attempted kidnapping." He stood. "Are we clear?" Both men nodded frantically. Mason walked back to the truck and drove around the abandoned SUV without looking back. Walter stared at him with something like awe. "What you just did?" "Training, nothing more." But Irene reached forward and squeezed his shoulder. She understood what it cost him to be that person again. Through it all, their faith in this stranger remained absolute. Coda served as early warning, his reactions telling Mason when danger approached. If you have ever trusted someone with your life, drop a comment below and tell us who that person was. Sometimes the people we meet in our darkest moments become the ones who matter most. By noon, they had cleared the forest and reached civilization. A small gas station appeared through the thinning snow, its lights a beacon of normalcy after hours of wilderness survival. Mason pulled in, buying hot coffee that he pressed into the Becketts' grateful hands, while they warmed themselves inside the truck. He stepped away to make a phone call. Danny answered on the third ring. "Brother, where are you?" "Montana. Got delayed." "The surgery is in 2 hours." "I know." Mason closed his eyes. "I'm not going to make it." Silence. Then Danny laughed, holding no bitterness. "Who are you helping?" "An elderly couple. They are about to lose their home. There are people trying to stop them from getting to court." "Then do what you have to do. I have doctors here. Those people have you." Danny's voice softened. "Go save them, brother. That is what we do." The call ended. Mason stood in the falling snow, letting Danny's words settle. That is what we do. Not what we did. What we do. Present. Ongoing. Maybe he had been wrong, hiding for 6 years, believing his failure meant he had nothing left to offer. Maybe survival was not about forgetting the ones you could not save. Maybe it was about honoring them by continuing to reach for the ones you still could. He returned to the truck with renewed determination. Whitmore was 30 miles away. The courthouse closed at 5 p.m. They had time, but barely. The final stretch proved most dangerous. As they approached town, Mason spotted the black SUV parked at an intersection ahead. 2 men stood beside it, watching every vehicle that passed. Mason reached for his phone and dialed 911. "I need to report a suspicious vehicle blocking traffic on Highway 12 near mile marker 47. 2 men appear to be armed, stopping cars and questioning drivers." The dispatcher promised to send units immediately. Within 8 minutes, 2 county sheriff cruisers arrived with lights flashing. The men scrambled to explain themselves as officers demanded identification. Mason drove past without slowing. In the rearview mirror, Victor Haynes's men were being detained for questioning. "That was clever," Walter said. "That was buying time. We need to be inside that courthouse before they talk their way out." Whitmore's downtown appeared through the windshield, a classic American main street with brick buildings and snow-covered sidewalks. The courthouse stood at the end, its clock tower showing 3:47 p.m. Mason parked directly in front. He helped Irene out while Walter gathered the water-damaged envelope containing their documents. They made it through the doors with minutes to spare. A clerk listened to their story with growing concern. explaining that the morning hearing had proceeded without them. The mining company had won a default judgment. However, given the circumstances, there might be grounds for appeal. "Tell Judge Harrison that the petitioners have evidence of witness tampering and obstruction," Mason said. "Tell him representatives of the opposing party deliberately sabotaged their vehicle and pursued them through a blizzard to prevent their attendance." The assistant disappeared into the back offices. 10 minutes later, they stood before Judge Harrison, a silver-haired man whose expression revealed nothing. Mason presented his phone recordings with clear timestamps. Walter produced the damaged documents and testified to years of harassment. The judge sat in silence for a long moment. "The evidence presented raises serious questions about Haynes Extraction's conduct," he finally said. "I am issuing an immediate stay of this morning's default judgment. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the county prosecutor for criminal investigation." Irene's hand flew to her mouth. Walter stood frozen. "Your home is safe for now, Mr. and Mrs. Beckett, and I would advise Mr. Haynes's associates to find themselves good attorneys." Outside, the snow had stopped falling. Late afternoon sun broke through clouds, painting the town in shades of gold. Irene stood on the courthouse steps, tears streaming down her face, laughing and crying simultaneously. Walter gripped Mason's hand with both of his. Coda sat at Mason's feet, tail wagging, as if he understood everything that had just happened. A commotion near the parking lot drew their attention. Victor Haynes stepped out of a black sedan, fury etched across his features. He strode toward the courthouse steps, flanked by two lawyers. "This is not over," he called out, his voice carrying across the snowy plaza. "You think you have won something here? You have won nothing. I have resources you cannot imagine, appeals that will drag on for years. I will bury you in paperwork until you beg to sell." Mason stepped forward, positioning himself between Haynes and the Becketts. "Mr. Haynes, I was hoping we would meet." Victor's eyes narrowed, taking in Mason's bearing, the calm confidence that radiated from him like heat from a forge. Something flickered in those cold eyes. Recognition, perhaps, of a predator more dangerous than himself. "And who might you be?" "Just a concerned citizen, one who has extensive documentation of your activities. Sabotage, stalking, attempted kidnapping, obstruction of justice." Mason smiled pleasantly. "I have already shared copies with the county prosecutor, the state attorney general, and 3 journalists who now work for national outlets." Victor's face went pale, then flushed. "You have no idea who you are dealing with." "Actually, I do. You are a man who thought he could bully an elderly couple because you have money, and they do not. You sent thugs to intimidate because you believed no one would stop you." Mason stepped closer, lowering his voice. "But some things are not for sale. Some people cannot be scared away. And some fights you were never going to win." Victor opened his mouth, but his attorney grabbed his arm, whispering urgently. Whatever the lawyer said drained remaining color from Victor's face. He shot one venomous look at Mason, then retreated to his sedan. "How can we ever thank you?" Walter finally managed. "You already did. Just did not know it." "What do you mean?" Mason hesitated. The question that had burned in him since their conversation in the truck demanded an answer. "Your son, Tommy, the mission where he got wounded. Do you know where it happened?" Walter frowned. "Somewhere in Afghanistan. He mentioned a valley, said the name sounded like it started with a K. Kunar." Mason felt the confirmation settle into his bones. The Kunar Valley, 8 years ago, a young SEAL behind a rock while the world exploded. The man who carried him out, I think that was me." Walter stared at him, connecting dots that suddenly made a picture neither had expected. "You saved my son." "I did not know his name. Never saw him again after medevac. I heard he recovered, went back to active duty. Never knew what happened after." Walter's composure crumbled. This stoic man who had walked through a blizzard, faced down corporate thugs, began to weep. "You gave him 3 more years. 3 years to serve his country, to come home for Christmas, to call his mother on her birthday, to tell us he loved us one more time." Irene wrapped her arms around her husband, and together they held each other while grief found new meaning. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that the people we help today might be connected to our lives in ways we cannot imagine. 6 weeks later, the snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of earth beneath and first signs of spring. Mason's truck pulled up to the Beckett homestead, a log cabin surrounded by towering pines, unchanged except for the fresh American flag on the porch. Coda jumped out before Mason could open his door, racing toward Irene, who stood waiting with open arms. She laughed as the dog nearly knocked her over, her voice strong and clear. Walter emerged from the house, moving steadily with his walking stick. With the legal threat lifted and Victor Haynes facing criminal charges, the weight had visibly lifted from his shoulders. "You came. I told you I would." They sat down to dinner at a table set for 4. In the center, a framed photograph of Tommy in dress uniform smiled at them all. Beside it, a small wooden box containing his trident, his letters home, and a new addition: a photo of Mason and Tommy's parents on the courthouse steps. After dinner, Irene excused herself to prepare coffee, leaving Mason and Walter alone by the fireplace. Coda lay between them, finally at peace. "Danny came through his surgery," Mason said. "Doctors say his prognosis is good." "I am glad." Mason stared into the flames. "He told me something that day. He said, 'That is what we do. Not what we did, what we do.' Tommy used to say something similar. Said being a SEAL was not a job you left behind. It was who you became." I forgot that for a while. After the boy I could not save. I thought if I could not save everyone, I had no right to save anyone. Mason shook his head. "Pretty foolish, looking back. Not foolish, human." Walter placed his hand on Mason's shoulder. "My son wrote about you in his last letter home. He said you never hesitated, said meeting you reminded him why he became a SEAL." Mason felt something loosen in his chest, a knot he had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without. "He was wrong about me not hesitating. I was terrified every second." "But you went anyway. That is what courage is. Not the absence of fear. The choice to act despite it." Irene returned with coffee, and conversation shifted to lighter topics. Spring planting, porch renovations, a shelter for rescued animals that Irene dreamed of opening. As evening wore on, Mason found himself laughing at Walter's stories, smiling at Irene's teasing, feeling more at home than anywhere in 6 years. When it came time to leave, he discovered he did not want to go. "The cabin feels different now," he admitted. "Emptier." Walter smiled knowingly. "Then do not go back to empty. The guest room has your name on it whenever you want." "I could not impose." "Impose?" Irene appeared in the doorway, Coda at her side. "You saved our home, our memories of Tommy. You gave us something to live for when we had nearly given up." She took his hands. "This house has been missing someone for 4 years. It would be nice to hear footsteps in the hallway again." Mason looked at the cabin, at the flag catching evening breeze, at warm light spilling from windows. He looked at these strangers who had become something more. He looked at Coda, whose tail had not stopped wagging. Some wounds never fully heal. The little boy would always haunt his dreams. Tommy's face would join the gallery of brothers lost. But standing on this porch, surrounded by people who had become family, Mason understood something he had spent 6 years failing to grasp. The mission was never over. Not as long as there were people who needed help and hands willing to reach for them. I will need to get my things from the cabin. Irene's face lit up like sunrise over Montana mountains. Walter nodded, as if this outcome had been inevitable from the moment Mason pulled over in a blizzard and extended his hand to 2 strangers freezing in the snow. That night, Mason sat on the porch, coda warm against his leg, watching stars emerge. Somewhere, Danny was recovering, probably planning their next fishing trip. Somewhere, Victor Haynes was learning that money could not protect a man from justice. And somewhere, in a valley in Afghanistan, a young SEAL named Tommy Beckett had looked at a stranger carrying him to safety and decided that was the kind of man he wanted to be. Not all missions came with medals. Not all victories made the news. But some fights mattered more than others, and sometimes the most important rescue happened by accident, on a snowy road, when you least expected to find something worth saving, including yourself. Mason Cole had spent 6 years believing he had nothing left to offer. It took 2 elderly strangers, 1 loyal dog, and a blizzard to prove him wrong. As stars wheeled overhead and peace settled into his bones, he made a promise to the little boy he could not save, to Tommy Beckett, who died a hero, to every brother lost along the way. He would keep reaching. He would keep trying. He would honor their memory not with guilt, but with action. Because there are missions that carry no medals. There are battles no one else will ever know about. And there are heroes who never seek the title, who simply see someone in need and refuse to look away. Sometimes the greatest rescues happen on empty roads in the middle of nowhere. And sometimes, when you reach out to save a stranger, you end up finding your way home.